Starting this session. To start the session, I would like to invite Dr. Hemlata Gupta, ma'am. A very warm welcome, ma'am.
Thank you.
Over to you.
So shall we start?
Yes, ma'am, we can.
So hello everyone. I am Dr. Hemlata Gupta. I worked as a senior consultant refractive surgery with Center for Sight Group of 5 hospitals. So we decided this topic of refractive surgery complications. As we all know, refractive surgery is one of the most popular elective surgeries worldwide. And since most of these patients are young and in their prime years and with very highly active lifestyle, they have very high expectations and very demanding. So we have to keep all this in mind and provide them with good visual outcomes. So despite excellent surgeries and high rate of patient satisfaction, the surgical complications still remains a challenge. So in this IC, we'll basically try to find out what problems you can face while doing the refractive surgery, common problems, especially for the beginners. And we have 5 speakers with us, very passionate speakers from the refractive surgery team of Center for Sight. And without wasting any further time, I would like to start from our first speaker, Dr. Pratik Teotia. He's a senior cornea consultant with Center for Sight Group of 5 hospitals, and he's gem of a person with excellent surgical and clinical skills. And he has a vast experience in handling all kind of surgical complications related to refractive surgery. So he will be talking about refractive surgery complications related to microkeratome LASIK. Over to you, Dr. Pratik.
Thank you, Dr. Hemlata, for the kind introduction. You have to stop screen share, Dr. Hemlata. Yes.
All right, that's it.
Okay. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, sir, we can.
Okay. So the topic I would be presenting today is microkeratome nuances.
The presentation is off, sir. I'm so sorry.
Present is not visible?
No, only the screen is visible. You haven't started the presentation.
Okay. I will start sharing. Now, can you see it?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So the topic of my today's presentation is microkeratome nuances, and I would be speaking on the introduction of microkeratome and the complications associated with it. I declare no financial interest in the presentation. Coming to the history of microkeratome, Jose van Berkel introduced the first manual microkeratome, which was modified for use in LASIK. It was first used for automated lamellar keratome analysis. Luis Antonio Ruiz introduced motorized microkeratome. First commercially available microkeratome was automated corneal shaper. Second generation microkeratome was a micro precision test model. Third generation microkeratome, Hansatome, is commercially available from 1997. Before choosing a microkeratome, we should know the principle and working of microkeratome. We should know the parameters that affect the quality of the flap. A microkeratome consists of following parts: console, body, head, blade, suction ring, and foot pedal. We can classify microkeratomes depending upon whether it is horizontal or vertical, or whether it is reusable or disposable. Depending upon the movement, we can classify them into linear, such as Moria M2, rotational, such as Hansatome, and pendular, such as Schwein. So depending upon whether the microkeratome is pre-assembled before use or it is assembly is done on the eye, we can classify them into pre-assembled, such as ML7, or on-eye assembly, such as Moria M2. So microkeratome is works on a principle of Carpenter's plane, also known as Randhur. Since blade is at a fixed distance from an applanation plane, which gives the determined thickness of the flap, cornea being spherical object will not be in contact with the applanation plane at all points along the blade motion. So we need very high IOP. So IOP rises in the range of 65 mm of edge after the applanation of suction ring, and it can be checked by Berkeley's tonometer. Blade oscillates at a very high speed to and fro in a direction orthogonal to the direction of the motion. Depending upon the mechanism of propulsion, we can classify microkeratome into geared and sliding. So this is an example of Hansatome, rotational microkeratome, where the head moves in the gear tracks of the suction ring to create a flap. And this is Moria SBK, which has got a linear mechanism of propulsion where the head slides into the gearless track. So after the application of the suction ring, head is assembled into the suction ring, and after pressing the foot pedal, forward and backward movement of the microcratome occurs, and then we can create the flap. Carriazo-pendular microcratome has got a drop and go mechanism. Cutting assembly has pendular motion, and the ball shape of the cutting head protects corneal center. Disposable microcratome eliminates the need for sterilization. They require minimal technical manipulation. They have advantage that they are packaged as sterile. There is no wear and tear of head, low probability of technician or mechanical setup error. It eliminates buildup of debris, thereby preventing DLK. It has low cost and it saves time. Microcratome factors that determine flap architecture are arching or linear motion, quality of blades cutting edge, speed of microcratome pass, speed of blade oscillation, and ease of pass on the cornea. Older generation microcratome gave us planar flaps, meniscus flaps, which are thicker in the periphery and thinner in the center. Though newer generation microcratomes such as ML7 and Moria SBK, they give us planar flaps which are uniform in thickness. Two mechanisms we should understand, that is translation and oscillation speed. So rate of oscillation determines the quality of the flap. Higher the oscillation rate, smoother the flap. And the translational speed determines the thickness of the flap. Faster the translational speed, the thinner is the flap. So a microcratome with 6,000 per minute blade oscillation but 1 mm translation gives the 100 cuts per mm, which is similar to a microcratome which has 24,000 per minute blade oscillation with a translational speed of 4 mm. ML7 comes to us in a calibrated blade shuttle, so it delivers the blade into the head via no touch technique. This improves the efficiency of the microcratome. Vacuum Hunter-Tom has got a single circular vacuum port, so risk of suction loss and pseudo suction is less. ML7 has got 4 extended vacuum slits, so it gives equal distribution of suction. Most microcratome, they give flap with a standard deviation of 10 to 30 micron. SBK is the term used for thin flaps which have a thickness of 90 to 110 micron. So these are the list of different microcratomes. So Hunter-Tom gave us superior flap. Zyoptics, Carriazo-pendular, ML7 and Moria M2 give us 360-degree flap, and newer generation microcratome Amadeus and Moria ML7 gives us nasal flap. Coming to complications, so one of the important complication is buttonhole. So if the cornea is steep, then due to central buckling, we can have buttonholes. So ablation should not be performed and flaps should be repositioned. Irregular thin flap can happen due to inadequate suction or old blade. Short flap can happen because of jamming of microcratome with hair or foreign body. Free cap is again an important complication which can happen in if the cornea is flat with pre-op K less than 38 diopter. If the free cap is small or decentered, we should abort the procedure and place the flap back with the support of bandage contact lens. If the free cap is of adequate size, well centered, then after retrieving the flap from the blade head assembly, we can keep the flap with epithelial side down, and then we can complete the procedure. So macrostria can happen due to movement of the flap after LASIK or incorrect position of the flap. So we can lift the flap, rehydrate and float it back and check for the flap adhesions. In severe cases, we need to debride the epithelium over the area of the stria. In microstria, we can observe, and this usually happens due to large myopic ablation. These usually resolve spontaneously. DLK is used for non-infective interface inflammation, which usually occurs 1 to 7 days after LASIK. So mild one, usually grade 1, can be treated with intensive topical steroids, and moderate one, which have diffuse involvement, can be apart from topical, we need to add systemic steroids. And grade 3 and 4 may need interface irrigation. So proposed cell theory is bacterial cell wall endotoxin, cleaning solution toxicity, and talcum from the globes and meibomian secretion. Microbial keratitis, again a rare complication, has to be dealt with. Epithelial ingrowth, usually present 1 to 3 months after LASIK. Risk factors are poor flap adhesion, buttonhole flaps, repeat LASIK, peripheral epithelial defects. So treatment consists of
You need to conclude the presentation as the time is up.
fine. So ideal microkeratome consists of smooth cut, options for creating flap with needed diameter, thickness, location of hinge. It should be easy to assemble. Monitoring of vacuum pressure during the procedure, easy to operate, easy to clean, allow visualization of cornea, and should be durable with predictable outcome. So which one to choose depends on the choice of surgeon. Discussion with the experienced surgeon can help. We should rely on published data and also on the customer service available in your area. Thank you. So Dr. Tulika can introduce the next speaker.
I think, sir, Dr. Tulika has been disconnected.
Okay, disconnected.
No, she's here. She's here, sir.
She's here.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So I am the next speaker right now here, and I'm a cornea consultant with Center for Sight, and I'm going to share my screen here right now. This is the one. So should I optimize the screen share for video clip? I have to click that, then only my video will run?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, fine. So I hope that it is just a moment.
Yes.
Screen is wall.
Yes, your screen is visible with presentation.
Okay, great. So in today's IC, I'll be discussing femtosecond LASIK complications and management. We know that femtosecond LASIK is one of the most safest surgery which is available, but it is not immune to any complication. So just a moment. Yeah. So the advantages of femtosecond laser over microkeratome is it reduces the variation in the flap thickness, increase the repeatability, and it decreased the microkeratome related flap complications. So that is why it is preferred these days. But it has its own complication. Intraop complications are flap related. There are femtosecond related complications. There are machine related complications. Today in this session, we will try to cover intraoperative complication, and if the time permits, we can go for the post-op complication as well. So the post-op complication, which all the lasers have, but there are some femto-related complications specific to femtosecond LASIK. So the flap tear. The flap tear is the first complication which happen because femtosecond laser cannot photo-disrupt corneal stroma in abnormal area of adherence of indent interface. Because of ocular rosacea, it can be corneal scarring, it can be dense opaque bubble layer, and thin flaps are at the highest risk of flap tear. It typically happens when you're doing the flap dissection. So how to prevent the incomplete and torn flap? If we have anterior, very peripheral anterior scar, superficial scar, we should increase the flap thickness to have a flap interface posterior to the scarring. If we have mild to moderate corneal scarring, you should adjust the femtosecond energy, or you can prefer microkeratome LASIK or advanced surface ablation. Severe scarring, we should always avoid femtosecond LASIK. So this is a video which is showing the torn flap, and the surgeon has not noticed the vertical gas break here. And they kept on doing the sweeping movement from superior to inferior, which is not advisable when you have a vertical gas brake. And certainly when on the top vertical gas brake, and you can see the flap tear here. Yes, so the flap is torn now. So if there is a small peripheral flap tears, just complete the dissection and do the stromal ablation. But if the flap tear is large, which is involving the pupillary axis, I would advise to reposition the flap back and abort the procedure. And surface ablation can be planned in future as a safe way to proceed. Decentered flap happens because of decentered suction ring, decentered pupil, parallax error, and suction ring slippage or pseudosection, which is the most common reason for the decentered flap. This video is showing that the pupil center is not in the center of the ring. Still, surgeon continued with the femtosecond laser, which is not advisable. What we should do here, we should always redock. We should use a centration software. If it is not too much decentration, we can always use the centration software. The only drawback of these centration software is it shrinks the flap diameter, and a lot of the laser platform, it is not even available. The most feared complication we have is a suction loss. So this happened because of flat corneas, deep set eyes, narrow pulpal fissure. Patient positioning is wrong. Most common is patient squeezing their eye, and the surgeon's movements are unstable. It's the most common reason for abandoning the procedure, but because of the unique lamellar cutting ability, the suction issues can often be overcome without compromising patient's outcome. So this is the video which I'm going to show you for the normal docking. We should always ensure that adequate initial suction is achieved and the centration should be achieved. Careful observation during docking is must. Once your central suction is achieved, we should pay attention to the periphery and evaluate the peripheral asymmetrical meniscus, which is usually a first sign of suction loss. This is a normal docking. The flap is pretty central and there is no suction break. This is a normal docking. It is the interlace docking. This video will show you how the suction loss happened by the end of the raster phase. And everything is going good. And you can see the peripheral meniscus once and then you can see the asymmetrical meniscus. This is a sign of suction loss. So what next? If suction loss happened early in this treatment, we should always stop and redock. When completing a partially cut flap, it is essential to ensure that each aspect of the cut, like vertical pocket, side cut, lamellar cut, is complete and contiguous. Then only you can always proceed with the treatment. Recommendation is the procedure should be reattempted immediately while the bubbles in interface are still present so that you can reach the same resection plane. Make sure the suction ring at the same place as initial suction. Suction loss happen at the raster stage. We should always take care that we have to perform next step immediately while the gas bubbles are still present to ensure the same resection plane. You can cancel on the menu, but not restart. Use the same applanation cone to reestablish the same depth. Use the new suction ring assembly and turn the pocket off. Since the vertical limbal pocket which absorbs the cavitation bubble is already complete, for second pass, adjust the parameter in order to minimize energy to deliver on the second pass. Redock, and we can use the arrow to align the new treatment on the previous treatment. If suction break after 3 attempts, we should always abort the procedure. And in the next procedure, we should always target the depth should be more than 50 micron away from the original lamellar pass to avoid any chatter or breakthrough into original lamellar pass. If suction break happened during side cut, suction loss after completion of raster cut happened, we should cancel and not restart. Use the applanation cone to reestablish the same depth. New suction ring assembly should be used. Select side cut only and decrease the flap diameter by 0.5 so that the side cut is well inside the lamellar cut. You can always use arrow to realign the previous treatment. So suction loss is not an end. If suction loss cannot re-establish after a partial cut, advanced surface ablation can be performed with MMC to decrease the stromal haze. Opaque bubble layer is a collection of gas bubble in the interlamellar spaces above and below the resection plane. Opaque bubble occur when the high pressure cavitation bubble formed by the femtosecond laser, they expand in the cleavage plane and become trapped in the anterior stroma. It is a very common finding in the femtosecond laser. Risk factors are patient has thicker cornea, older patient with denser peripheral collagen. It create a problem it creates a tight flap adhesion so that you can face flap tears during dissection, and it interferes with the laser pulses, flap creation, residual stromal bed measurement, and examiner laser tracking system. So this is a video which is showing the principle of OBL. Applanation happened, and we can see the cavitation bubbles are in the resection plane, and suddenly the bubbles are above and below the resection plane, which is causing a dense OBL here. This is in the patient. You can see that it's raster phase start very well, and this is the dense OBL formed here, and which is covering and obscuring the pupil margin. So can we prevent OBL? Yeah, we should decrease the flap size if excessive scleral show is noted at the time of suction ring application. We should adjust the laser sectioning. Lines, spot spacing should be less, and the larger pocket size. Okay, and lighter applanation technique should be used. OPL management, we should sweep the flap with a flap lifting spatula with downward pressure to spread the bubbles. And some surgeon prefers to wait. It can take 30 minutes to several hours to go, and it has no significant visual problems. So this is a video I have taken from Dr. Bruce Allen, and this is the method he's using to decrease the OBL during the surgery. He's using a blunt spatula to just scratch it out. And now the pupil margin is pretty visible and it will not affect the tracking now. So you can always go for stromal ablation here. Vertical gas breakthrough, which scares all the surgeon. It can occur when cavitation bubble dissects superiorly toward the Bowman's layer and through the epithelium. A buttonhole is created with a deep black appearance. Risk factors are when the laser flap is too thin, less than 100 micron, and focal breaks in the Bowman's, corneal scars, and previous radial keratectomy was done. So if we proceed, we can have split flap, pseudo buttonhole intra-op period. We can have epithelial ingrowth and corneal scarring in the post-op period. If what we should do, if you have complete buttonhole, we should always terminate the procedure and we can perform surface ablation in the future. If it is not complete, then you can always see the whitish appearance and you can see if there is no flap tear, you can always go ahead with this. Anterior chamber gas bubble, it is a complication which happen when the entire cut is delivered very close to the limbus in case of very small wide to wide or corneal diameter. So risk factors are large flap diameter, small corneal diameter, and high suction pressure. It interferes with the pupil tracking, and the small flap diameter should be considered if the scleral show is excessive after applying the suction. This video is showing that a very central flap we are making with the femtosecond, and we can see the peripheral air bubbles. And once the flap is done, you can see that there are air bubble in the center of the cornea. Yeah, in the AC. Sorry. So we should test pupil tracking if the function is working.
You need to conclude. I'm really sorry.
If we, some people wait for bubbles to resolve, it takes 30 minutes to several hours. Sometimes you can always turn off the tracker and carry on with the stromal ablation. The main target is to make a pupil larger than the diameter of gas bubble so that the pupil tracking and iris registration is not affected. You can ask patient to move eye rapidly right to left and then tap on the ocular surface to break the surface tension so the multiple gas bubble can coalesce and form one large bubble. We can dim the illumination, examiner operating microscope to dilate the pupil. We can use mydriatics. The only downside of using mydriatics is that it changes the center of the pupil. So I will flip this and we'll go for post-op complications. And striae are already covered by Dr. Prateek. The only thing I wanted to just add in this, that microstriae don't need any management if it is not affecting your vision, and macrostriae definitely need treatment as soon as possible. Sooner you take action, better is the result. The causes are thin flap, higher ablation depth, misalignment of flap after replacement, flap shrinkage and desiccation, flap wrinkling during stretching, tenting of corneal flap over ablated stromal bed, and excessive manipulation. So we should always prevent by marking the flap to ensure the correct final positioning. So yeah, so this video is showing how to deal with the fixed flap. We should remove the epithelium because the epitheliums are between the folds, which will not let your folds flatten out. So you should remove the epithelium and use these Miro cells and stretch it perpendicular to the stria so that you should do this exercise until your visual axis is clear. Very important post-op complication, which is very specific to femtosecond LASIK, is rainbow glare. Rainbow glare is a rare optical aberration. It is caused by grating pattern created on the back surface of the LASIK flap, which lead to diffractive light scattering after femtosecond LASIK. So when patient is looking through the monochromatic light source, lateral and vertical ghost or replication of sources can be perceived. It has been reported to be most common when the femtosecond flap is created, but for some reason, the excimer laser ablation is aborted. So this is a patient drawing, which that's how they explain that, how they see through the monochromatic light source. And this is a camera assisted simulation of the rainbow glare. This usually rainbow glare is transient and vanishes within week or months. In some rare cases, it leads to persistent and disturbing visual symptoms. The undersurface photoablation of LASIK flap be an effective method to reduce the symptom related to rainbow glare. Because this complication is very rare, we cannot validate the treatment which is given in the literature, because it is done in very less number of patients, but it definitely works. So the another complication which is very troublesome to the patient is transient light sensitivity syndrome. It is a rare femtosecond associated complication that result in an episode of acute bothersome photophobia in absence of other clinical signs and symptoms, typically 2 to 6 weeks after femtosecond LASIK. So the theory, we don't know the root cause of it, but there are theory given for the etiology of TLSS. It is gas bubble theory. It explains the tract-related iridocyclitis and scleritis. In unusual cases, the gas from the evaporated cornea escapes into the episclera over the ciliary body and creates the irritation through the ciliary body, result in the photophobia. So gas bubble theory explains the laser energy converts corneal tissue into carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and water. The gas creates a tract near the hinge out to the periphery where trabecular meshwork and iris inserted. During the tissue...
Dr. Tulika, we can conclude. So
I'm sorry?
We can conclude our presentation.
Yes, I'm almost done. So this inflammatory cytokines are produced, which cause ciliary body inflammation. And the activated keratinocytes. So gas bubble tract and activated keratinocyte, they both work hand in glove for the TLSS. The mainstay of treatment is corticosteroid. We can always prevent this by lowering the laser energy, decrease the suction time, and dissection with the small spores separation. Thank you very much for the patient listening.
Thank you, Dr. Tulika. Now I would like to invite our next speaker, Dr. Garvid Bhutani. He would be speaking on surface ablation with MMC, complications and management. Garvid, you can start your screen share.
Sir, I think...
Dr. Garvid is not here?
No, sir. He hasn't got the link yet. We are just working on it. In the meantime, we can go ahead with Dr. Malik, sir, Raghav Malik.
Now Dr. Raghav can start his presentation on post-LASIK dry eyes management. So Dr. Raghav is Associate Consultant in Cornea and Refractive Surgery Department, and he is a young surgeon, very interested in refractive surgery.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today, I would be talking about post-LASIK dry eye and the causes and its management. So as we all know, that dryness after LASIK is very well known. It is nothing new. But yes, there have been new treatment modalities which we will explore. So according to the Dry Eye Workup 2 in 2017, dry eye was defined as a multifactorial disease of the ocular surface characterized by the loss of homeostasis of the tear film and accompanied by ocular symptoms, in which tear film instability and hyperosmolarity, ocular surface inflammation and damage, and neurosensory abnormalities play etiological roles, of which hyperosmolarity is the most important. Whenever the quality is reduced, we will always have symptoms of dry eye. Now, risk factors of dry eye post-LASIK are multifactorial, including low level, moderate level, and high level evidence. Today, we will be focusing on corneal refractive surgery, which comes under a high evidence risk of dry eye. Now, why do we have post-LASIK dry eye? It is one of the most common complications following any refractive surgery. Although signs and symptoms of dry eye are most common in the intermediate post-op period, but we can have a plateau phase within about 3-4 months and it starts decreasing after 6 to 12 months. But in many patients, it can stay for much longer. Now, prevalence of dry eye symptoms prior to LASIK is estimated to be about 38 to 75%. Immediately after LASIK, 95% of patients report some dry eye symptoms. Dry eye symptoms are reported in as high as 60% of patients 1 month after LASIK, and they can stay also up to 6 to 12 months. Now, risk factors are pre-existing dry eye disease, contact lens use, Asian race, the female sex, ocular disorders such as ocular allergies, deeper ablations, that is very high myopia, hyperopic treatments because we have a smaller eye and we have a bigger flap, thicker LASIK flaps, the flap creation method, whether it is a microkeratome or a femto LASIK, and also the hinge orientation, whether it is nasal or it is superior. The pathophysiology of dry eye post LASIK, it is because of corneal afferent nerve damage with resultant hypoesthesia. So once the nerve is damaged, the cycle between the corneal reflex and the brain is broken, and therefore we have an increased vicious cycle of inflammation and dryness. Conjunctival goblet cell loss from the LASIK suction ring, more so with the microkeratome because we have a higher pressure. Abnormal tear distribution from the corneal contour, decreased tear production, and inflammation from altered cytokine levels. Now, in a smile, in LASIK, we have vertical cuts made in the cornea, but while in the smile, we have delamination cuts. This is the corneal renderation of the corneal structures in the cornea. In a LASIK, we have a vertical cut, and you can see all the healthy nerves have been cut. In the smile, we have delamination cuts, and only a small vertical cut is made for the main nerve. So, as the number of nerves are much healthier in the smile compared to a LASIK. This is the confocal microscopy showing the structure of nerves is much more preserved in a smile compared to a LASIK. Similarly, there have been studies that compare dry eye post LASIK in smile as well as LASIK. We see that the tear breakup time, osmolarity, and ocular surface disease index is much less altered in smile compared to a LASIK. Now, symptoms that a person can feel is ocular dryness, pain, burning, photophobia, foreign body sensation, grittiness, and redness. May or may not have any clinical signs, but the patient can have symptoms and disturbance in various visual function because the tear is very important to form a very smooth ocular refracting surface. So if any damage to the tear film, the patient might not enjoy the full advantage of a refractive surgery. Now, diagnosis, the history is the most important part. What is the medical history? Ocular history, including surgical history and contact lens wear. Systemic medications, ocular medication, allergies, what are chief complaints, and whether the patient already has a dysfunctional tear syndrome or a dry eye syndrome. Then we come on to examination like visual acuity, refraction, speed questionnaires like the speed or the OSDI, tear osmolarity, checking for various anti-inflammatory markers like the matrix metalloproteinase 9, and a Schirmer's test 1 and 2. Further tests that can be done are the lid and lashes test to see rule out any movement glands and tear breakup time. Then we can do staining of the cornea and the anterior surface and evaluation and expression of the meibomian glands. Additional corneal sensations, corneal topography, imaging of the meibomian gland or meibomitis, serum antibody markers, and cultures from the ocular surface. Now, clinical evidence of different diagnostic tests. This shows a patient enlarged meibomian orifices showing the meibomian gland disease. And this is a patient with a severe aqueous deficient dry eye because of staining with fluorescein. This is lissamine green, and this is rose bengal, showing staining of the conjunctiva because of aqueous deficiency dry eye. Another ocular analyzer will give us a very deep insight into laser interferometry, that it gives the lipid layer thickness, the tear meniscus height, the non-invasive breakup time, meibography, blepharitis, ocular redness classification, pupillometry, white to white measurement, and anterior segmentation. This is a patient with an ocular surface analyzer test. This shows that the NIBUT is almost in the medium range, but the lipid layer is very low. It's in the red zone, while the glands themselves are quite good. So this is a patient that has a lipid layer deficiency. It is very easy to explain to the patient showing these 3 colored graphs. Now the management. Now the goals of the management are to minimize evaporative tear loss, stabilize the tear film, protect ocular surface, repair ocular surface damage, increase lubrication and enhance the glandular secretion, and also curb inflammation. The most important goal is to maintain the normal hemostasis and get the osmolarity of the tears back to normal. Now, a stepwise approach would be to give a preservative-free artificial tears, punctal plug, topical cyclosporin, autologous serum, so a sterile lens. Artificial tears are very important and are the mainstay for each and every case of dry eye, irrespective of whether it is a mucous layer or the aqueous layer or the lipid layer. We have to consider whether the lubricant has the preservatives, what is the pH, the viscosity, the tonicity, and what kind of electrolytes that the lubricant has, and they are different for different types of dry eye. Punctal plugs are a way of preserving one's tears. We give a punctal plug so that the tears that are produced are not drained away. So it increases the availability of tears. Immunomodulatory agents like a cyclosporin A can be used pre-operatively and post-operatively to decrease lymphocytes and cytokine levels, thereby breaking the cycle of inflammation and dryness. Autologous serum using the patient's own serum mixed with sterile solution, sterile saline can be used. These are also said to have a very good amount of anti-inflammatory properties and they reduce dry eye. Scleral lenses are a very good option. They keep the cornea bathed in a continuous irrigation of a reservoir of tears, thereby creating a very healthy environment for the cornea. Other treatment modalities that have come up is the very intense pulse of light is given to the cornea, to the meibomian glands, especially the lower lids, that help in people who have good meibomian glands but low lipid thickness here. So this is a short video showing how we can give the eyes and bursts of light are given like this. The patient feels comfort immediately and it's given in 3 separate sittings. Oral antibiotics like tetracyclines can be used to reduce inflammation. Emerging treatment include a topical nerve growth factor that also is said to decrease inflammation. And the drugs currently under investigation are a diclofenac, tetrasodium, and a sodium hyaluronate combination, and insulin-like growth factor. To prevent dryness post-LASIK, we have to go to the pre-operative settings and check and find the appropriate candidates and treat it before we take the person up for a refractive surgery. So to summarize, dry eye is a very common complication after refractive surgery, and patient who will have an uncomplicated surgery might not be as happy as you think. So the candidates for the surgery should be chosen very well by doing a thorough pre-operative examination and treatment post-operative. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Daga, for the excellent presentation and sticking to your time also. Now we have with us Dr. Hemlata Gupta. She is working with Center for Sight as senior consultant, and she will be speaking on SMILE complications and management. You can stop your screen share, Raghav, and Dr. Hemlata can start her screen share.
I have stopped sharing, sir.
Okay. Dr. Hemlata has...
Good afternoon, everyone. Good
Yes.
afternoon. Let me just share my screen. Just a second. Can you see this PPT?
Yes.
Okay.
Dr. Hemlata. You
So,
can
good afternoon, everyone. So, I'll be starting with the topic SMILE complications and management. Just a second. I think I need to start my video. Yeah, that's it. So refractive surgery, as we all know, has evolved significantly in the past few decades and is moving towards the preservation of the corneal biomechanics to increase the safety and to achieve abrasion-free results. And we are moving slowly from the conventional flap-based procedures to flapless procedures like SMILE or RELAX. So despite the increase in the safety of the procedure, there are many possible challenges with SMILE also, both intraoperative and postoperatively. Intraoperatively, we can have suction loss, incorrect dissection, epithelial abrasion, side cut extension, and postoperative dry eyes, epithelial ingrowth, and lenticular fragment retention, which is peculiar to smile surgery, DLK, ectasia, regression. So I'll try to show you how these complications can be managed one by one. So the first and foremost is black spots. The incidence of the black spots ranges from 11 to 14% in smile cases. Causes could be water droplets on the cornea, debris, or air entrapped between the cornea and the cone. So the problem with the black spots is there are uncut areas because the laser doesn't get fired through the black spot, and that makes your dissection really difficult. Like for example, in this case, the smile procedure started normally. You can see this black spot in the center. Maybe something was attached to the cone that was missed. Cone was not clean, but we proceeded with the laser treatment, and it seems very small area and harmless, but it gave me a really tough time in the OT. And you can see that the lenticule is almost dissected in majority of the area except this one. I had to use sharp dissector. And since this is uncut stroma, actually you are not in the right plane sometimes. That can actually cause abrasions or irregular astigmatism in the post-operative period. So you have to be very gentle in dissecting through this uncut area. Since it is paracentral, not involving the visual axis, so we can still proceed, and it was a very small area, so you can still proceed with the lenticle removal. But at the end, you always spread the lenticule on the cornea to see if it is removed in toto. This is another case where we started the procedure and suddenly noticed that actually there was a cilia lying on the cornea that got unnoticed. And we actually couldn't decide at that time, proceeded with the laser treatment. And you can see this linear uncut area in the cornea. Now, since this area is involving the visual axis, now in this case, you have to be very, very careful, because if you apply too much of force to remove the tissue in that area, that can lead to cap tear. And if you get a cap tear in the visual axis, that can be very dangerous or harmful for the patient. Side cut extension is something actually harmless. This can be there when you have difficult lenticle dissection, sometimes due to excessive OBL, or if the patient is highly uncooperative. So in these kind of patients, you first have to tell the patient that you have to look into the green light. It might disappear in between, and do not search for the light and keep on looking straight. Now coming on to the more serious problem, that is suction loss, which is more common in smile as compared to the femtosecond laser, because of the longer duration of the suction, that is 25 to 28 seconds. Incidence of the suction loss is 0.17 to 5%, but in experienced hands, it can be reduced to 0.5%. It can be due to sudden head or eye movement. Sometimes ocular factors are caused, like small paper aperture, loose corneal epithelium, excessive tearing. So you have to look into the cause. Now, suction loss can happen at any stage: refractive lenticular cut, lenticular side cut, flap cut, or flap side cut. Accordingly, in VisuMax, the good thing is that immediately the machine will go into the repair module, and the machine will suggest you where the suction loss has happened and what is the next step. So you just look into this screen and decide about your management. You have to be very, very quick. We can't let the corneal edema to happen. At almost all the stages of suction loss, you can proceed with the same smile procedure except stage 2. When the posterior lenticle cut is greater than 10%, in that case, you have to switch to either femtosecond flap procedure or surface ablation. This is a case where the suction loss happened at stage 2 when the posterior lenticular cut was more than 10%. We immediately converted the procedure into flap-based procedure and fired the excimer laser to complete the treatment. And here in this patient, the suction loss happened at the anterior lenticular cut. And sometimes there is just, reflexly, there is a sudden head movement. And you can see that the fluid is coming through the suction port. And here we get the suction loss. So once the lenticular cut is complete, nothing to worry about. The only thing is you have to have a very good centration, sometimes because the OBL patient is not able to center properly. Once that centration is done and it is appropriate, then you can, proceed with the routine SMILE procedure. And because of the dense OBL in the center, you might have a little bit of difficult dissection, but otherwise, the routine lenticular removal is possible. I'll just forward the video a bit. So in this particular case, the lenticle could be removed in toto. If there is a little fragment of the lenticle which is separate, you just spread it on the cornea and just see if it is removed completely. You should not leave any fragment behind. And this is very interesting case where this was in the beginning in our learning phase, where almost whole of the procedure was complete except for the side cut incision, for the main incision. And we tried to do that incision, make that incision with the manually with the help of keratome blade, but that was unsuccessful. So at the same sitting, we proceeded with the circle scan. In circle scan, you actually convert the cap into a flap. And since lenticular formation was already there, we just raise the flap and then remove the lenticle. It's more like flex. Now the lenticle is adherent to the undersurface of the cap. So you have to do very gentle dissection, otherwise you can have tears in the cap, which can later compromise the visual quality. So very gently remove the lenticle and then examine the lenticle in the end. Another problem with the SMILE surgery is if you're not able to identify the planes correctly. Sometimes that happens that you dissect the posterior plane first and the anterior plane is not dissected. That way the lenticle actually gets stuck to the cap. And then the most important thing is, again, to take a sharp instrument or maybe micro forceps, like we have done in this case, and just separate a little area of the lenticle. Once you have identified the anterior plane or you're able to catch hold of the lenticle, then you proceed with rest of your dissection. So it takes a little time, but in most of the cases, actually, you are able to identify the planes. It just increases your surgical time. So identification of correct planes, we have various signs, white ring sign, meniscus sign, or shimmer sign. All these signs are enable us to identify the planes correctly. And this was a case in which there was lenticular fragmentation while removing, and this happens when you have not separated the anterior and posterior planes correctly from all 360 degree, all around 360 degree. So first you separate the lenticle and then try to remove the lenticle using forceps. If you try to pull the lenticle, sometimes a major part of the lenticle comes out and you are left with a little fragments inside. So most of these problems are manageable, but these are encountered in the early learning curve. So in the beginner phase, avoid cases of low myopia, difficult orbital anatomy, high astigmatism, or highly uncooperative patients. You can encounter epithelial ingrowth, which is more difficult to handle in SMILE patients because the ingrowth is there inside the pocket. There are cases of ectasia reported even with SMILE surgery. So most of these cases are diagnosed or undiagnosed cases of forming-fruste keratoconus who had an unreliable preoperative topography scan. There are cases of sterile infiltrate or fungal ulceration also after SMILE surgery. So most of these challenges that we encounter with SMILE are very uncommon, mostly encountered in learning phase and manageable with no loss of best corrected visual acuity. Appropriate knowledge of the management is the key to success. Thank you very much for the patient listening.
Thank you, Dr. Hemlata, for such an exhaustive talk on the complications of SMILE surgery. And now I would like to ask Dr. Garvit Bhutani to start the presentation on surface ablation with MMC, complications and management. Dr. Garvit is working with Center for Sight as consultant cornea, cataract, and refractive surgery.
Hello, good afternoon all. Is my screen visible?
Yes, Dr. Gargi, you can start.
Hi. So I'll be speaking about surface ablations with mitomycin C, its complications and management. So surface ablation basically means altering the radius of curvature of the anterior corneal surface using a laser technique, which is the excimer laser. The word excimer basically comes from a combination of two words, excited dimer. The gas most commonly used these days in the excimer laser is argon fluoride gas. And the interesting part in the history of this is that the engineering behind it was given by an Indian scientist named R. Srinivasan. So what happens is basically initially the two molecules are in low energy state and they are activated by a laser beam, and once they come back from a high energy state to a low energy state, they emit a photon which is has a wavelength of 193 nanometers, and this has the ability to break down all the carbon nitrogen bonds. This is how your excimer laser works, ablates the cornea. The first PRK was performed in 1980s in Germany, but FDA took its own sweet time to give approval based on the results in 1995. So there have been successive generations of excimer laser starting from the first. Now we are into the sixth generation. Initially we started with broad beam laser with fixed optic zones, which actually had a very led to very high incidence of complications with surface ablations like haze and all. But now that we are into faster ablation rates with good tracking systems, most of the refractive surgery has become very predictable and the complications have minimized. So as I said, older systems had broad beams and there was variation in the amount of energy delivered with every ray of laser delivered, which led to more complications like under or over correction or inaccuracy in the correction of the refraction. The newer laser systems are high-speed lasers. They have fast trackers, so the less incidence of decentrations. Pupil monitoring systems again help us with reducing the incidence of decentrations, and they give us better customization profiles. Now, the types of surface ablation procedures available are PRK, LASIK, epi-LASIK, or transepithelial PRK. Basically, in these, as I already described, we remove the outermost layer, that's the epithelium, with the help of multiple ways. Either can be with the help of alcohol or manual removal, or with the help of a blade as in epi-LASIK, and then subsequently a excimer laser is fired to alter the shape of the cornea. And so basically they are all different names, but actually have similar outcomes. They work the same. They have similar outcomes in terms of pain perception, speed of epithelial healing, visual recovery, and final outcome. We at Center for Sight prefer doing a PRK over and above other procedures. So coming to the complications which have been described, I'll be dividing the complications into short term, which are pain, delayed visual recovery, subepithelial haze, keratitis, and other epithelial healing issues, and steroid-induced glaucoma, because we have to use steroids for longer duration and higher frequency as compared to other refractive surgeries. So the incidence of glaucoma is slightly higher. Coming to the long-term complications, they can be under and overcorrection, regression, decentration, haze, corneal ectasia, dry eye, and visual phenomena like glare, halos, etc. We need to really counsel our patients well for all these complications, because the delayed visual recovery and haze are the most common things that happen with most of the refractive surface ablations, and the pain post-op also needs sometimes oral anti-inflammatory. So coming to post-inflammatory pain, post-operative pain, post-PRK, it stays there for 3 to 5 days, and most patients will need oral anti-inflammatory agents. There have been 3 different mechanisms described for this pain. One is an inflammatory pain. The other is a nociceptive pain that happens because of the bare nerve endings which are left after the ablation. and neuropathic pain. So for the treatment of these, first the bandage contact lens and the tight bandage help with the nociceptive pain because it reduces the movement, rubbing of the eyelids with every blink onto the exposed nerve endings. And for the inflammatory pain, we use topical and systemic anti-inflammatory agents as per the need. There have been studies and reports of gabapentin being used for the neuropathic component of the pain, but it is highly controversial. Coming to another short-term complication, keratitis, that can be further divided as non-infectious and infectious. It is very important to differentiate between the two types of keratitis. Coming to non-infectious keratitis, it's usually a staphylococcal marginal hypersensitivity reaction. It's a type 3 hypersensitivity reaction, and the infiltrates are usually marginal, and there is history of rosacea or blepharitis present. And there is no important sign is that there is no anterior chamber reaction noted in non-infectious keratitis versus an infectious keratitis, which will usually have an anterior chamber inflammation. And in this, what happens is basically the bacterial antigens from the lid trigger an immune response with deposition of complement complexes in the peripheral cornea, activating the complementary pathway. So coming to management of non-infectious keratitis, it's usually a self-limiting condition, usually resolves in 2 to 3 weeks with topical corticosteroids only. And the signs of healing are just like any other infiltrate. The resolution of epithelial defect will be seen, the cellularity of the surrounding cornea will decrease, and the infiltrate margins will start to show rounding as the infiltrate starts responding. It is important to emphasize in such patients about lid hygiene and antibiotic ointments for the lids. And it has been shown that systemic doxycycline also helps in such cases because of its anti-inflammatory and anti-collagenollytic effect. Coming to infectious keratitis, now infectious keratitis in refractive surgery can be of two types. It can be either early onset or late onset. Early onset is when it presents within the first week and accounts for majority of the cases, 50 to 60% of the cases, and it's most commonly because of a bacterial infection, which can be the staphylococcal or streptococcal. The late onset after 1 week is a slow growing, or usually because of a slow growing organism like non-tubercular mycobacteria, NTM or nocardia or fungi, etc. So this is one of the largest series about infective keratitis post vision correction. They studied over 7 years retrospectively the refractive procedures, which were about 6,45,920 procedures, and of those only 101 eyes had some form of keratitis. And as you can see in the table, the culture proven microbial keratitis was much lower in PRK as compared to LASIK in this study, and even the probable microbial keratitis was much lower, and the LASIK had more incidence of marginal keratitis. So the similar management of infective keratitis is usually similar to management of a corneal ulcer. We should scrape the infiltrate, identify the organism, and do a targeted antibiotic therapy. This is a flowchart given by Das Shilpa et al. In their recent paper in IJO, where they have described for the first 1 week after the scraping, they prefer starting fortified vancomycin, moxifloxacin to cover for the most common organism, and in more than 1 week old infiltrates, they prefer starting amikacin and moxifloxacin to cover for the non-tubercle mycobacteria and other slow growing organisms. And they wait for the microbiological workup and then start basically based on that. Now coming to long-term complications, the most common complication is haze, which occurs actually in less than 2% of patients in low myopia group and occurs in about 8.6% in the high myopia group. It can lead to refractive regression and glare and reduction in best corrected visual acuity. There are two types of haze basically described. Type 1 tends to appear 1 to 3 months after surgery and tends to disappear within few months after surgery. Type 2 is a late onset corneal haze, which appears after 3 months of surgery and persists for more than 3 years and sometimes permanently as well. The ablation, so factors which are responsible or are involved in haze formation are ablation depth, the amount of ablation we are doing. Because we do more ablation for the higher grades of myopia, the incidence of haze is higher in higher myopias. The integrity of the basement membrane, if it is not intact, it can lead to haze. The deposition of abnormal extracellular matrix as a part of wound healing process is another factor responsible for haze formation. Moving further, as I already described, if you're correcting higher myopia, higher astigmatism, you have a patient with autoimmune condition, and these are the conditions where the chances of haze formation are more. Interesting study by Stovanovic and Nitter has shown that the higher exposure to ultraviolet radiation can lead to a late onset haze. So areas where the UV exposure is more, those patients can be probably asked to wear UV protective glasses for about 1 year post surgery. That's what they have recommended. There's a grading system described by Hitzman, which is used for management of corneal haze in the first 0 to 2 grades. Topical steroids or topical non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs are sufficient for the treatment. Grades 2 to 4 usually need mechanical epithelial debridement with adjuvant like MMC or a laser scrape with a PTK or excimer laser treatment. Grade 5 is basically a corneal opacity which eventually needs a corneal transplant for visual rehabilitation. So this was a female patient who had developed haze
Sorry
towards.
to interrupt, sir, but the time is up. You need to conclude. I'm really sorry for this.
Yeah, I'm just concluding. So for prevention of haze, as I described, topical steroids and use of MMC is important. MMC is basically alkylating agents used in 0.02% concentration for 15 to 120 seconds. And the rule is basically 10 seconds for every diopter corrected. And this should always be necessarily followed by a thorough saline wash. This is the chart we follow for our patients usually. And the complications related to MMC described are either vascular endothelial injury, which is rare after refractive surgeries because the MMC in these cases are in contact with the avascular tissue, that is cornea. And epithelialization is slightly delayed in cases where you will use your mitomycin C. There is a controversy about whether the keratocyte density increases or decreases after mitomycin C use, and there is a definite decrease in the endothelial cells post use of MMC, and this is directly related to the time of contact, and the higher the thickness, higher the ablation. So other adjuvants which can be used to reduce haze are oral vitamin C, systemic steroids, cold BSS lavage after surgery, and there are trials going about plasma rich in growth factors to reduce the haze. Dry eye, Raghav has extensively covered, so I'll be skipping. Under and overcorrection was more common in the previous days, but these days it's very rare. Refractive regression basically is gradual, partial or complete loss of refractive error which has been corrected, and usually because of epithelial hyperplasia and stromal remodeling. Ectasia is very rare again after PRK. It's reported only in about 4% of the cases. Decentration is also uncommon these days because we have better tracking system. Abrasions again are less as compared to LASIK, but are more in patients with higher pupillary diameters. So management, the over and under correction can usually be corrected with the second procedure if there is adequate thickness left, and we have to wait for 3 to 6 months before stability of refraction before proceeding with the retreatment. So I prefer doing PRK in patients with thin corneas or patients with recurrent corneal erosion or corneal dystrophy, patients who have...
Requesting you, sir, please to conclude the presentation as we have to...
Last slide. So there are certain intraoperative considerations to prevent complication. Incomplete epithelial removal could be cause of irregular refractive result, and plain removal of epithelium can lead to hydration changes. We recommend performing excimer laser within 1 minute after the epithelium. If patient loses fixation briefly and refixes immediately, the ablation can continue. But if there is a rapid loss of fixation without an immediate refixation, laser should be stopped immediately. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Garvit. Now we have our last presenter, Dr. Kiran. So she will be speaking up regarding perfect surgery unhappy patients. So if Dr. Tulika and Dr. Hemlata has done perfect eye LASIK and smile, but still the patient is unhappy, so she will be telling what are the reasons and how to deal with them. Dr. Kiran, please start your screen share.
Good afternoon. I'll be just starting with my screen share, sir. So is my screen visible, sir?
Yes.
Good afternoon. We all have encountered the 20 by unhappy patients, and it's not a good feeling to have them. A 20/20 vision post-refractive surgery is everybody's goal. And many a times most of the times we are very, very successful in achieving it, but yet we have all encountered such unhappy patients. What are we tending to miss in them and how can we help them is the goal of my presentation. So the original articles which were published in 2004 and then in 2008 rated the patient satisfaction after LASIK ranging from 82 to 98%. However, the recent articles which speak of modern laser in situ keratoconiosis outcomes published in 2016 report that the patient satisfied out of the dissatisfied patients, only 1.2% patients land up being dissatisfied with surgery. How do we help these 1.2% patients as well? Why did we come to the thought of dissatisfaction at the first place? So FDA had approved LASIK bang in 1995, but it was in 2008 when a group of 140 dissatisfied patients who had suicidal ideations and extreme dissatisfaction and difficulty in their daily activities that FDA started with the LASIK Quality of Life Collaboration Project in 2009, giving rise to the patient-related outcome with LASIK Project 1 and 2. The purpose of PROWL 1 and PROWL 2 was finding out through an online web-based questionnaire what are the visual symptoms, what are the dry eye symptoms, what is the satisfaction level of a patient with vision and with LASIK, and what are the quality of life indicators along with the OSD indicators in a patient who is supposed to go ahead for a refractive surgery, and what are the outcomes 3 months later. So we found by the results of a survey of complications that the most important 4 reasons why a patient lands up being dissatisfied after refractive surgery despite being 20/20 is the advent of new night vision disturbances, dry and ocular surface diseases, non-strabismic visual disturbances, and last but not the least, psychological factors and what is the patient expecting out of the surgery. So the new vision disturbances could be double images, glare, halo, and starburst. And also of importance to notice that the patient may be having low contrast visual acuity. I would, before we mention what are the preoperative factors that we must have considered, I would like to bring to your notice that the PROWL 1 and PROWL 2 were able to identify that because we are not testing these patients or we are not asking these patients, we miss that these patients were preoperatively also having symptoms like ghosting, glare, halos, and starburst. And up to 46% of the patients reported development of no new symptoms after the surgery. In fact, 34% patients had these symptoms even prior to surgery. Out of these participants, it was also noticed that these symptoms that tended to develop, more than 90 to 50% range of the symptoms tended to resolve within 3 months after the refractive surgery. So what could have been the major reasons that we would have tended to miss? Most important being the wavefront analysis and finding out of higher order aberrations, specifically the spherical aberration, which should have been ideally corrected with a wavefront optimized profile and not with the standard laser procedures, which tend to induce these spherical aberrations. Better still, if we could go for wavefront guided and completely wavefront optimized platforms. Also of controversial role have been the pupil size versus the ablation zone. Earlier till 2008, it was considered very important that the ablation zone should be larger than the mesopic pupil size. However, now with the latest studies, the role has been found to be controversial. The patients who are inching towards their 40s or older should not be left behind in the refractive surgery, but should definitely be identified for the possibility of a dysfunctional lens syndrome, wherein the lens might appear to be clear, but the patient could be having minimal scattering of light within the lens, giving rise to difficulties post-surgery. So what happens after the surgery? After the surgery, patient could be having induced higher order aberrations, a residual corneal astigmatism. There could have been a subclinical decentration or irregular epithelial changes, which are causing the patients to have this night vision symptoms. The advanced ablation systems may prevent these more so. In surgeries, the advanced technology of SMILE, the patient-related outcomes have identified that the night vision disturbances are also extremely minimal. The match comparisons of higher order aberrations which have been induced by SMILE versus LASIK versus PRK found that SMILE gives better results in mesopic conditions, though femtolasic and PRK may have better results in photopic, but SMILE is better when it comes to mesopic conditions, even in high myopia correction. How do we treat these patients? In the initial part, the patients can be advised a pupillary constricting medicine such as brimonidine. Patient could be advised that while driving, you should switch on the dashboard light inside your car so that the pupil comes down to a smaller size. Surface treatment and also treatment with the help of nutraceuticals can also help the patient in regularizing the epithelial surface. If nothing is helping the patient, a customized topo-guided ablation zone enlargement may also land up helping the patient. So this we see that if there is only corneal residual astigmatism, a PAL syndrome has been described in 2019, which mentions that a vector planning giving rise to emphasis on the topography guided values of corneal astigmatism also may help the patient by recorrecting the patient later. Role of counseling and neural adaptation must not be forgotten, and studies have proven that it can take approximately 10 weeks for the visual symptoms to adapt to this new state of blur following the refractive surgery. Dr. Raghav has already excellently covered the ocular surface diseases. I'm just reiterating that the damage to corneal nerves, toxic epitheliopathy, alterations in the morphology, and exaggeration of the pre-existing dry eye is the most important reason. And PROWL 1 and 2 showed to us that there are worse visual symptoms with increasing severity of OSD. Also, the satisfaction with the vision and surgery falls down as the OSD becomes more and more severe. Do not miss the possibility of hormonal imbalances, contact lens induced meibomian gland dysfunctions or dropouts, and the patient history of medications of being on isotretinoin or amiodarone or antidepressants. All this history is extremely important. A pre-op clinical examination by simple staining, Schirmer, OSD will help us in clinching the diagnosis pre-operatively and avoid us in treating dry eye diseases patients aggressively for refractive without managing them prior to surgery. Post-operative, of course, the same management principles apply to the dry eye management. Pre-operatively, it has been found that the optimization of the ocular surface with IPL therapies helps the patient in adapting to refractive surgery faster. Coming to non-strabismic binocular vision anomalies, a patient presenting with doubling of vision, difficulty in focusing, asthenopia, strains, glare halos, or an apparent regression, we must not miss the possibility of the patient having vergence or accommodative anomalies. These anomalies are, present even otherwise in the patient prior to surgery as well. In 30 to 40% of the patients of age 21 to 40 years, the possibility of convergence insufficiency or excess, divergence insufficiency or excess is always there. So we must take care and properly investigate the patient, not only for visual acuity, anterior posterior segment examination, but also for stereopsis, the establishment of dominant eye, for apparent tropias or phorias, and also the looking for any near point of convergence or accommodation anomalies. These patients should be subjected to vision therapy, and if they are coming even after surgery, a vision therapy will definitely help them in overcoming their problems. Don't forget to identify the dominant eye, because undercorrection in this eye deranges the balance. Monovision will only help patients who have equal visual acuity with distance correction only in the dominant eye. Never overcorrect the myopes, it will decrease their convergence. And NSBVA is an important differential in patients presenting as regression. When the patient is complaining of glare and halos, a binocular vision assessment is warranted, and a pre-op BVA will help us in improving the surgical outcomes of these patients. Not to forget, finally, the personality issues of the patient, which can have an important implication on what outcome we are giving to the patient. So health-related quality of life questionnaires prior to surgery can help us in identifying how optimistic, how health-prone, how anxious or depressive, or how desirable, responsive to the society expectations the patient is after the surgery. These studies have also proven that, once we are investigating the patient's ocular problems post-surgery, it is important to work also on their psychological strengths when they are dealing with their ocular discomfort and dissatisfaction. So 2020 is definitely our goal, and the pursuit of happiness is always a lofty goal. But I do wish that after this small snippet, we'll all land up with only 20 and happy patients. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kiran, for the wonderful presentation. So I think I'll start the discussion from you only. So I would like to know that many a times we encounter a patient who has 20/20 vision post-operatively after any kind of refractive surgery. But the patient complains of a non-specific pain while working on screen and a little headache, and that persists maybe after a few months after LASIK surgery, and patient is very unhappy. So how will you proceed in these kind of patients? What kind of counseling or investigations or treatment would you recommend?
I would say the most common reason these patients are presenting with ocular dysesthesias is their surface issues. It becomes very important to diagnose their dry eye, because excessive screen time is most of the times related to evaporative dry eye syndromes. Patient, if well investigated in your clinic, if you don't have extensive equipment, you can even do simple Schirmer's, staining, ocular surface staining, and treat the patient maximally with, the non-preservative lubricant eye drops. More important is their, mental counseling of environmental changes that they're supposed to take, into consideration, the light in which they're sitting, the way they are sitting in front of their computer, their posture, and also how frequently they are blinking. All of this becomes extremely important. The newer machines like ocular surface analyzers are even able to assess the blink rate and the blink completion of the patient. So many a times these young professionals who have been operated for a refractive surgery do not blink completely. So if we are, counseling the patients on these lines, most of the times the patient will be able to come back to normalcy. Also, the binocular vision assessment. They could be having simple issues like convergence insufficiency, because their screen time is glued to intermediate distance. So once they are looking ahead, they are having a divergence excess and they are not able to focus, and this gives rise to stress and strain.
And is there any role of vitamin B12 which is recommended by some people?
Vitamin B12 and vitamin D are again recommended for ocular surface improvement. Vitamin B12 also has an important role in the neural supply to the muscles. So that can help.
So you also recommended that you also suggested that the IPL use pre-LASIK actually can help. So what kind of patients are the candidates for the IPL treatment?
Again, these are evaporative dry eye patients. And if we notice their lids, their lid margins, we will notice even in the younger patients, the meibomian glands are plugged. So if the openings are plugged and you are assessing them on infrared light, even on a simple AR machine or on an ocular surface analyzer, and you're finding that the glands are good, only, more than 70% of your glands are alive, doing a single sitting of IPL tends to help in opening up in these pores, liquefying the stuck oil which was in these glands, and improves the ocular surface. And many centers are now doing a single session of IPL therapy prior to giving patients the option of refractive surgery, and also in premium IOL patients, because the tear film abnormalities do have an important role to play when it comes to post-operative satisfaction of the patient.
So
and after 1 week, you can do the surgery. Once you've done the IPL session, you can do the surgery 1 week later. Most of these will have the low lipid layer in their analysis.
Thank you, Dr. Kiran. Anybody else has any question for Dr. Kiran? Or we proceed with the rest of the discussion?
How much time is left for discussion, ma'am?
I think we have 10-12 more minutes.
Okay. So, Raghav, can you please tell us, among all the keratorefractive surgeries such as PRK, LASIK, iLASIK, or SMILE, which one causes the least dry eye?
So definitely, like I mentioned, SMILE will cause the least dry eye because we have delamination cuts and not vertical cuts. The delamination cuts will also not sever the nerves completely, and we have only a 3 millimeter vertical cut that gives us entry into the main pocket. So there have been studies that say, I'm not saying that all studies say that SMILE has lower dry eye. It will depend on the target population and the test population, but majority of the studies do say, and we also see that our patients post SMILE are much happier than a post LASIK or a post PRK.
So what are the investigations, Raghav, you recommend for a dry eye patient who comes to your clinic maybe after 2 months or 3 months of refractive procedure? So what is the routine practice? What kind of investigations would you do to see the severity of the dryness?
Ma'am, of course, we start with the Schirmer's first and foremost. We do it the Schirmer's one and then with anesthetic. And we have to do a battery of tests, including the breakup time, the staining and meibography, but all this combined into one, we use the OSA right now. So the OSA gives us a comprehensive analysis of the entire anterior surface and the meibography along with the layers of the tear. So like Kiran ma'am just mentioned, the majority of these patients will have a lipid layer thickness deficit. So because of that, and they are young patients, so they have very good meibomian gland architecture. So they benefit very well from an IPL. But from the diagnosis point of view, just doing an OSA will give us a very comprehensive analysis. But not all centers have an OSA. So we can just start with the Schirmer's. We can do a good fluorescence staining. We can see whether the patient is symptomatic or not. We compare the patients. If we can give the patient a questionnaire, a speed questionnaire gives us a speed question is just 1 page and about 7 questions. So patient can compare himself or herself whether he or she is better or worse, because most of these patients are generally very happy. Only about 5-7% of the population of the refractive surgery patients will come with symptoms, and on further investigating will we have some signs, and then we can treat from there.
Thank you, Raghav, for explaining that to us. I have a question for Dr. Garvit. Garvit, if you encounter a patient with post-operative PRK haze, so how do you go about it? In post-operative period, what kind of eye drops you recommend?
So,
does that depend upon the severity of the haze, and how do you go about it?
Yeah, so initially, to begin with, I prefer using Predfort in these patients. And in case they have a steroid-induced glaucoma response, then I shift to Lotepred. But yes, my preferable...
what would be the frequency of the Predecetate eye drop?
So Predecetate, to begin with, I start at 6 times a day. And the taper is usually depending on the amount of refractive error I have corrected. So if I've corrected somewhere close to 6-7 diopters, then I'll taper it slowly over 2 months sometimes, or maybe 3 months as well. But if it's a smaller refractive error I've corrected, I can also taper it off in 6 weeks.
So is there any role of mitomycin C in eye drops in the post-operative period?
Yes, it can help in certain haze that appears slightly later, not immediately after surgery. I mean, the haze that appears say 2 or 3 months after the surgery. In those cases, that does help in lower concentrations.
But how safe are that? Have you seen any cases of scleral necrosis or corneal melting with mitomycin C eye drops in these post-PRK haze patients?
No, I am yet to come across. I believe now after reading and after so much of experience, I think it's more of a theoretical complication, the scleral melt, more because the concentrations we are using are so low that it cannot cause an endothelial injury, which will lead to subsequently a necrosis. Plus the contact time is reduced, and one way you can actually decrease is basically use a drop of lubricant after MMC, so that you decrease the contact time of the MMC with basically the sclera.
Thank you, Dr. Garvit. Now another question for Dr. Prateek. I would like to know that what would you do? How will you manage a case where you have incomplete flap while using microkeratome?
So if the flap is incomplete and it has not the microkeratome has not passed completely over the visual axis, then it's better to postpone the surgery, place the flap back, and you can redo the surgery after 3 months.
So you'll, while doing redo surgery, will you recut the flap at a deeper depth, or you'll proceed with
So
surface
the
ablation?
options we have, either we can shift to interlace LASIK and cut at a deeper level,
Oh, how much
or
depth?
at least 30 to 40 micron deeper. And other option is you can do PRK. If the number to be corrected is not much, it is within 6 diopters, then I would go with PRK. And if it is cornea is allowing us to create a deeper level flap, then make a flap with femtolasic at a 30 to 40 micron deeper level and go ahead with iLASIK.
Sometimes the flap is cut to almost like 70%, and 20-30% away from the visual access area is left. So how can we proceed in such cases?
See, if it is coming within the optical zone, then it's better to discontinue the surgery. But if the flap is cut to a level which is beyond the optical zone, then you can cover the flap margins with the Vexel sponge and go ahead with the surgery. But most of the cases, incomplete flap won't give you an area where the optical zone can be safely corrected. So it is always better to postpone the surgery in these cases and do resurgery after a 3-month period.
I have one more question for you. So it's very easy to center in SMILE or femtosecond laser patients. So with the, especially for the beginners, it's sometimes difficult. The centration is difficult with microkeratome. What are your tips or pearls for that?
So microkeratomes have markings on the suction ring. So that marking should intersect the pupillary area.
So do you always use trypan blue dye to mark the cornea for all surgery?
Yes. For all my microkeratome LASIK, I mark the cornea with the marking pen. And because in case if any complication arises, these markings help us in dealing with the complications better. And while replying to your questions, so while placing the suction ring to the cornea, there are some markings, vertical markings, which you can see that they are intersecting the pupillary margin, and then place your suction ring, and after that apply microkeratome pass.
So we by this we come to an end of the session, as we have to move on to the next session. I thank Dr. Hemlata Gupta ma'am for leading this session wonderfully, and also all the speakers for their wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. Have a good day. Stay safe.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
So we end the session over here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr.